The following week was tense because the fallout from Karen's failed pool stunt still lingered in the neighborhood. And though most people avoided talking about it openly, I could feel the shift in how some of the residents looked at me, not with hostility, but with sympathy. Because they now understood firsthand how far Karen would go to manipulate people. Yet instead of crawling back into her hole like most people would after such a public humiliation, Karen doubled down, escalating the conflict in ways that I could hardly believe. And it began with her sending out an official HOA newsletter that painted me as the villain, twisting the story to claim that I had promised to host the community event and then maliciously drain the pool at the last minute to embarrass her and punish the neighborhood. And though the exaggerations were laughable, she had printed the letter on HOA stationery and mailed it to every single house. So when I pulled my copy from the mailbox and read it, I felt my blood boil. But I also knew that her tactic was intentional because she was trying to use her authority as HOA president to rewrite the narrative and isolate me from the community. But what she didn't realize was that plenty of neighbors who had been at the so-called party saw what really happened. And some of them quietly began stopping by to tell me they were disgusted with how she had lied, including one couple who admitted they were considering moving just to get away from her reign of terror. And their frustration gave me confidence that I wasn't alone in this. So I drafted my own letter attaching copies of my property survey, the deed that clearly listed the pool as private, and screenshots of texts and emails. Karen had sent me demanding I open it to the community, and while I didn't mail it to the entire neighborhood, I hand-delivered copies to those who had shown concern, knowing that word would spread. And sure enough, within days, I could see Karen's little circle of unquestioning supporters shrinking as more people began to distance themselves from her. Though instead of realizing she was losing ground, she lashed out harder, slapping me with yet another violation notice claiming I was neglecting my pool by leaving it empty, which was laughable considering she was the reason it had been drained in the first place. But the notice came with a hefty fine, and when I refused to pay it, she scheduled a hearing at the next HOA board meeting, which I knew would be another circus. So I prepared like I was going to trial, organizing every piece of evidence, including testimony from the pool company that had drained it under my orders, proof of payment from my personal account, and even video footage from my doorbell camera showing Karen trespassing on my property weeks earlier, because I wasn't about to let her spin this in her favor again. And when the day of the meeting came, the room was packed with more residents than I had ever seen before. Some clearly there for the drama, others out of genuine concern. And as I sat at the back waiting for my turn, Karen strutted in like a general ready for war, dressed in her usual pastel blouse and oversized sunglasses, though the tension in her jaw betrayed how rattled she truly was. And when the hearing began, she launched into a long speech about how I was undermining community harmony and hoarding resources, and how the HOA had every right to enforce the proper use of amenities. But before she could get too far, I interrupted by holding up my deed and saying, loud enough for the room to hear, "This is not an amenity. This is my private property," which drew a murmur from the audience. And then I presented the property survey, handing copies to the board members one by one so they could see with their own eyes that the pool fell entirely within my lot. And when Karen tried to wave it off as irrelevant paperwork, one of the newer board members frowned and said, "No, this looks legitimate," which was the first crack in her armor. But the real blow came when I played the doorbell footage on my tablet for everyone to see, showing Karen walking through my gate uninvited, clipboard in hand, peering over the fence at the pool like she was inspecting it, and the collective gasp in the room was deafening, with whispers breaking out immediately. And even some of her longtime allies looked shaken, because trespassing was something no one could defend. And though Karen stammered and tried to claim she was just checking on community property, the evidence spoke for itself. And by the time I finished my presentation, it was clear. I had not only dismantled her accusations, but had also exposed her abuse of power, leaving the board with no choice but to dismiss the fines entirely. Though to my disappointment, they stopped short of removing her from her position, claiming they didn't have enough evidence of misconduct to justify it. But I could tell by the whispers and sidelong glances in the room that her authority had taken a serious hit. And while I walked home that night feeling victorious, I also couldn't shake the nagging thought that Karen wasn't finished. Because people like her didn't just accept defeat. They regrouped and plotted something worse. And sure enough, the very next morning I woke up to the sound of hammering, only to discover a massive sign staked in my yard. Planted without my permission. That read in bold letters, "Community Pool closed until further notice, HOA management." And my jaw nearly hit the floor because it was the boldest, most illegal move she had made yet, brazenly claiming authority over something she had no rights to. And as I ripped the sign out of the ground, fury surged through me. But I also realized she was forcing my hand to escalate this battle beyond HOA meetings. Because now she was openly committing acts that bordered on harassment and property damage. And if I didn't involve higher authorities, she was going to keep pushing until she wore me down. So I took the sign straight to the local police station and filed a harassment report, handing over the pile of evidence I had been gathering. And though the officer on duty raised his eyebrows at the absurdity of it all, he took my statement seriously, warning me that HOA disputes could get messy, but assuring me that trespassing and unauthorized signage were violations that could be acted upon. And walking out of the station, I felt a flicker of relief. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a much larger war. Because Karen, humiliated twice and now under official scrutiny, was going to come back harder, more desperate, and more reckless than ever before, and I had to be ready for the storm she was about to unleash. When you buy a home with a private pool, the last thing you expect is that the neighborhood busybody would one day walk in, point at it, and claim it belongs to her. But that's exactly what happened to me, and it turned into one of the craziest HOA battles of my life. So stick with me through this story because you won't believe the lengths this Karen went to try and control my property. And before I dive deeper into how I dealt with her, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss these jaw-dropping real-life HOA dramas that will leave you shaking your head in disbelief. Because this one in particular had me fuming yet laughing in the end when I pulled the most unexpected move that left her red-faced in front of all her guests. But it started innocently enough with me buying this house that had been on the market for months simply because it needed work. Though the pool was in perfect condition, sparkling clean, deep, wide, and a big selling point for me since I love swimming. But almost as soon as I moved in, I noticed that there was this one neighbor, the kind everyone warned me about, the infamous HOA president named Karen. A woman who strutted around like she owned the entire neighborhood, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, even when the sun was nowhere to be seen. And she took it upon herself to make sure everyone complied with her vision of how the neighborhood should look, which would have been tolerable if she had stuck to the actual HOA bylaws. But Karen was the type who made up rules as she went, enforcing them with her circle of gossiping friends, so I braced myself for trouble. Yet I didn't expect it to come as fast as it did, because within a week of unpacking, she was already at my door, tapping her pen against her clipboard and informing me in her sharp voice that the community pool schedule needed to be followed. And I blinked at her, asking her what she meant, only for her to gesture at my pool and say, "This pool is part of the community, isn't it?" And when I told her no, it was clearly inside my property lines, built and owned by me. She smirked and said, "We'll see about that," before walking away like she had just declared war. And from then on, I noticed her and her little HOA board friends circling my property, whispering and pointing at my pool as if they had some kind of right to it. But I brushed it off until the first real violation came in the mail, a thick envelope with the HOA letterhead, stating that I had failed to properly register my pool for community use, which nearly made me laugh, except the letter also threatened fines. And I knew then that Karen was serious about trying to take control. So I went to the next HOA meeting to confront them, sitting in the back until it was my turn to speak. And when I stood up, I made it clear that the pool was mine, privately built, maintained with my money, and absolutely not part of their so-called community amenities. But Karen, sitting at the head of the table, interrupted me mid-sentence with that smug smile, saying, "Well, it looks like a community pool, doesn't it?" And the room of her allies chuckled. I realized she was trying to gaslight the entire neighborhood into believing my property was up for grabs. So I brought out the property survey papers I had wisely brought with me, showing the boundary lines, the construction permits, and everything that proved the pool was 100% mine. And while a few of the other board members looked uneasy, Karen just narrowed her eyes and said, "We'll see how long that lasts," which gave me chills because she clearly wasn't going to stop. And true enough, the next few weeks were a nightmare of her and her followers, trespassing to inspect the pool, of kids mysteriously showing up to swim even though I had locked the gate, and of me receiving constant fines in the mail, all of which I contested, but which drained my energy. Until the breaking point came when I overheard her bragging at the mailbox one morning about how she was planning a community event at the pool next Saturday, inviting half the neighborhood. And when I stepped closer to confirm what I had heard, she smiled sweetly and said, "Don't worry. You'll have plenty of fun being the host. It's your pool after all," as though it were a done deal. But what she didn't know was that I was already planning my revenge. Because if she thought she could turn my property into her personal party space, she had another thing coming, so I played along, nodding politely while secretly making calls to a pool maintenance company. And by Friday night, just hours before her big event, I had the pool completely drained, every last drop of water gone, leaving only the empty concrete shell behind, which looked eerie under the pool lights. But to me it was beautiful, because I knew the look on Karen's face the next day would be priceless. And as I stood there staring at the empty pool, I couldn't help but laugh, wondering how she would spin this one. But what I didn't realize yet was that the stunt I pulled would set off a chain. It's a reaction that escalated the feud to levels I never imagined, turning the neighborhood into a battleground between me and the HOA, and Karen into an obsessed rival who was determined to crush me no matter the cost, even if it meant destroying her own reputation in the process. The morning of Karen's big so-called community pool party arrived with a kind of nervous excitement in the air, because I knew that she had been bragging all week about how she was going to host this grand event at our pool, which still made my blood boil every time I thought about it. But I forced myself to stay calm because I had already set the trap by draining the pool the night before. And as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I watched as cars began to line up along the street, SUVs, sedans, and even a few minivans unloading families dressed in swimsuits with towels and coolers in hand. Children running toward the gate laughing as though they were about to enter some water park, while Karen stood out front with her clipboard and megaphone, waving like some kind of queen welcoming her subjects. And I had to stifle a laugh because she truly believed she had pulled this off. But the moment of truth came as she strutted toward my gate with a group of her guests in tow, only to stop dead in her tracks when she saw the empty pool, the concrete floor gleaming under the morning sun, not a single drop of water in it. Just dry tiles echoing with the footsteps of the first few people who dared to step closer. And the stunned silence that followed was everything I had hoped for, with one of the kids blurting out, "Mom, where's the water?" which made several parents start whispering in confusion. But Karen, determined to keep her composure, clapped her hands nervously and said, "Oh, don't worry. There must be a little maintenance issue. It'll be filled in no time," except her voice cracked in the middle, and I could see the panic behind her sunglasses as more and more people started questioning why they were standing around in swimsuits for a party with no pool. And that's when I decided to make my entrance, walking out casually with my coffee in hand, pretending to be surprised as I said loudly, "Oh, Karen, what happened here? I thought you told everyone this was going to be the pool party of the year, but it looks like you forgot to check." With the actual owner of the pool, and the way everyone turned to look at me and then at her was priceless, because the illusion she had built up was unraveling right before their eyes. But of course Karen tried to recover, stepping forward with a fake smile plastered on her face, insisting that this was just a misunderstanding and that I had accidentally emptied the pool. But I wasn't about to let her get away with that, so I raised my voice enough for everyone to hear, explaining how she had planned this whole event without my permission, trespassed repeatedly, and even sent me bogus fines to try and strong-arm me into letting her use my private property as if it belonged to the HOA. And I could see the shock spreading across the crowd as they realized what she had been doing. A few of them glaring at her while others quietly ushered their kids away, clearly embarrassed to be caught in the middle of her scheme. But Karen, being Karen, didn't back down easily, and she tried to turn it around on me by saying, well, if you really cared about the community, you would share what you have instead of being selfish. Which almost made me laugh out loud because the hypocrisy was staggering. But instead of arguing, I simply shrugged and said, if you cared about the community, you wouldn't lie to them about having access to something that isn't yours. And the murmurs of agreement from the crowd made it clear she was losing control of the narrative. Though she wasn't about to give up entirely, so she turned to her board members, who had been standing awkwardly by the gate, and demanded they support her, but even they looked uncomfortable. One of them mumbling something about how they weren't informed about this event, and in that moment Karen realized she had overplayed her hand, because not only was her little party ruined, but she had also exposed herself as a liar in front of dozens of people. And the cherry on top was when one of the parents shouted, "This is ridiculous, Karen, you made us drag our kids here for nothing," before storming back to their car, and soon more families followed, shaking their heads and muttering about how they should have known better, leaving Karen standing there fuming as her grand spectacle collapsed in less than 15 minutes. And I stood on my porch enjoying every second of it, sipping my coffee like it was the sweetest victory drink I'd ever had. But I knew Karen too well to think she would stop there, because humiliation like that was something she couldn't stomach. And sure enough, later that evening, I found another envelope in my mailbox. Thicker this time, stuffed with papers accusing me of willful damage to community property and threatening to take me to court for denying residents access to a shared amenity, which nearly made me choke on my dinner because the sheer audacity was unbelievable. Yet it also showed just how desperate she was to regain control. And while part of me was tempted to laugh it off, I also knew this was escalating beyond just embarrassment. Now this was Karen trying to weaponize the HOA against me in a legal battle. And if I didn't fight back properly, she might actually convince enough people to make my life miserable. So I started gathering evidence, photographing the property lines again, compiling all the letters she had sent, and even asking some of the neighbors who had been at the pool party if they'd be willing to make statements about what they had witnessed. And surprisingly, many of them agreed because, as much as they liked keeping peace in the neighborhood, they had seen firsthand how manipulative and dishonest she had been, and they didn't want her to keep getting away with it. So within a week, I had a file thick with documents proving the pool was mine and that she had been trespassing and harassing me. But before I could even present it anywhere, Karen showed up on my porch one evening. Not with her usual smug smile, but with a furious scowl, jabbing her finger at me as she hissed, "You think you embarrassed me, but this isn't over. I'll make sure you regret this," before storming off again. And the venom in her voice told me she was more determined than ever, which made me realize that the battle for my pool had only just begun, and that I had better be prepared for whatever insane stunt she was planning next. Because Karen was like a cornered animal now, and cornered animals don't back down, they bite. In the days that followed Karen's disastrous pool stunt, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip like bees around a hive. And while some people tried to laugh it off as just another one of her Karen moments, others admitted openly that they had lost all faith in her as HOA president. But for Karen, the humiliation only fueled her fury, and she shifted into overdrive, doubling down on her crusade to make my life miserable. And I knew she was plotting something big because she went quiet for a few days, which in Karen's world was the most dangerous sign of all. And sure enough, by the end of the week I began receiving an onslaught of official-looking letters in the mail, each stamped with the HOAS logo and each more absurd than the last, claiming I was in violation of community standards for everything from having too many lawn chairs on my patio to the unsanctioned fencing around my pool. And it was clear she was weaponizing her HOA power to bury me in fines. But what she didn't count on was that I kept every single piece of paper, filed neatly in a binder alongside all the other harassment I'd documented, because my lawyer had advised me to build a fortress of evidence, and I had done exactly that. And when Karen realized her letters weren't intimidating me, she escalated further, showing up outside my house with a clipboard and camera, taking pictures of my property like she was preparing for a demolition order, loudly telling passersby that she was gathering evidence of my violations. And I could see the unease in my neighbors' faces as they hurried past, no longer supporting her antics, but too afraid to confront her directly. Because Karen had spent years building a reputation for vengeance against anyone who crossed her. And while she strutted up and down the sidewalk, I stood calmly on my porch, camera in hand, recording every second of her harassment, making sure there would be no room for denial later. But she only smirked at me, saying, "Record all you want. You'll be the one in court when the HOA takes your property for known compliance." And those words made my blood run cold because they revealed her true plan. She wanted to strip me of my home entirely, using the HOA as her weapon. And that night, as I sat at my kitchen table flipping through the stack of letters, I realized this was bigger than a pool dispute. It was about power, control, and Karen's obsession with punishing anyone who defied her. So I called my lawyer, explaining everything that had happened. And he told me plainly, "It's time to file a restraining order and start building a case against the HOA itself. She's gone too far." And though part of me dreaded the idea of a full-scale legal battle, another part of me felt a strange relief, because finally I would have the chance to drag all of Karen's misdeeds into the light where she couldn't hide. And as we began drafting the paperwork, Karen seemed to sense that I was preparing for war. Because the next day, she went even further, hiring contractors without my knowledge or consent and sending them to my property to inspect the pool, claiming it was unsafe. And when I refused to let them in, she called the police, trying to spin the story that I was endangering the neighborhood by refusing mandatory safety checks. But when the officers arrived and I presented the deed, the restraining order filing, and the stack of harassment letters, they shook their heads, clearly tired of being dragged into Karen's personal vendettas, and warned her that if she kept abusing emergency services, she would be facing charges herself. And I could see the cracks in her armor beginning to show as she sputtered excuses, her confidence faltering. Because for the first time, people in authority were siding with me openly instead of indulging her lies. And that was when Karen truly snapped, calling an emergency HOA meeting to try and rally support. But this time it backfired spectacularly, because when she stood at the front of the clubhouse ranting about my selfishness and illegal ownership, half the seats were empty. And of the people who did show up, many openly questioned her judgment, asking why she had wasted their time and HOA funds on flyers, parties, and harassment campaigns instead of addressing real community issues. And watching her flail as her so-called loyal subjects turned against her was almost surreal. Like seeing a dictator realize their power had evaporated overnight. But even then, she refused to back down, declaring that she was prepared to take the matter to civil court. And while some neighbors groaned and walked out, a handful of die-hard loyalists clapped, the last flicker of her crumbling influence. And I knew then that this wasn't going to end quietly. Because Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. And sure enough, the very next morning, I was served with official notice. The HOA was suing me, claiming that by hoarding the pool, I was in violation of community bylaws and endangering property values. And though the accusations were laughable, the reality of being dragged into court was daunting. And I felt the weight of it pressing down on me as I sat at my lawyer's office. The stack of evidence between us like a shield, and he leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers thoughtfully, saying, "She's overplayed her hand. We are not just going to defend against this. We're going to countersue for harassment, defamation, and abuse of power." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a surge of hope. Because now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about holding Karen accountable in a way she could never spin or escape. And as the weeks ticked by, the legal filings flew back and forth, each more vicious than the last. And while Karen strutted around the neighborhood telling anyone who would listen that she was about to own my house, I stayed quiet, focused, letting her dig herself deeper. And by the time the first court date was scheduled, the neighborhood had shifted entirely, with more and more people reaching out privately to tell me they supported me, that they were tired of Karen's bullying, but had been too afraid to speak up before. And now they were ready to see her knocked off her throne, and that solidarity gave me strength. Because this battle was no longer just mine, it was for every neighbor who had ever suffered under Karen's tyranny. And as I looked out at my pool one quiet evening, the water shimmering under the fading sunlight, I knew the final showdown was coming, and I was ready for it. because Karen had turned this into a war, and I had every intention of making sure she lost everything she had gambled on her obsession with power. The day of Karen's so-called grand reopening pool party arrived like a storm cloud, heavy with anticipation and tension that you could practically taste in the air. Because for the past week I had watched neighbors debate in hushed tones whether the event was even real. And while many saw through her lies and wanted nothing to do with it, others were curious enough, loyal enough to Karen to plan on attending. And I knew I had a front row seat to whatever disaster she was about to unleash. So I prepared carefully, making sure my new security cameras were recording every angle of the property, alerting the local police ahead of time that there might be a trespassing issue, and even inviting my lawyer to be present just in case things got truly out of hand. And when noon rolled around, I stood by my window, coffee in hand, watching as the first cars began pulling into the cul-de-sac, families stepping out with pool bags, kids bouncing with excitement, and even a couple of lawn chairs being unfolded on the sidewalk, and it was surreal. Like watching people arrive for a party at a venue that didn't exist, because as far as they knew, this was sanctioned. But I was about to remind everyone whose property they were stepping onto. And then Karen herself arrived in full regalia sun hat, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard tucked under her arm, strutting down the street like a queen ready to preside over her kingdom, barking orders at a few HOA loyalists who were setting up a folding table stacked with refreshments and sign-in sheets. And I nearly laughed out loud because it looked less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a circus, with Karen as the ringmaster. And when she finally approached my gate, trying the latch as if she owned the place, she found it locked and shouted theatrically, "Open this gate. This is community property now," drawing the attention of everyone gathered. But instead of answering her demands, I stepped outside calmly, holding my deed in one hand and my phone in the other, recording the entire interaction, and said in a loud, even voice, "This pool belongs to me and only me. And anyone who tries to enter without my permission will be trespassing." And for a moment there was silence, just the summer breeze rustling the trees. But then Karen laughed, loud and shrill, and turned to the crowd, proclaiming, "Don't listen to him, he's a liar, and this pool was built for all of us, not just for one selfish man who thinks he can hoard it." And some people actually cheered, nodding along as if her nonsense made sense. But others looked uneasy, glancing between me and the locked gate, unsure who to believe. And that was exactly what I wanted, because I knew the more she pushed, the more obvious her lies would become. And sure enough, she marched back to the folding table, grabbed a stack of flyers, and began handing them out like a politician, each one emblazoned with the words "Community Pool Reopening," with my address printed in bold letters beneath it. And when my lawyer, who had been waiting quietly in his car, walked up and took one of the flyers, his eyebrows shot up, and he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This is illegal. This property is privately owned, and Mrs. Karen here has no right to claim otherwise." And suddenly, the air shifted, whispers rippling through the crowd as people realized this wasn't just a neighborly dispute. This was a legal matter, and Karen's face turned bright red as she snapped, "Don't you dare spread lies. I am the HOA president, and that gives me authority over every property in this community." Which was her biggest mistake yet, because that statement was not only false, it was now captured on video along with everything else, and I knew it would be invaluable in the courtroom later. But before things could calm down, she made an even bolder move, signaling to a couple of her loyalists to start climbing the fence, shouting, "Go ahead. Open it from the inside. We have every right to enjoy what's ours." And my blood boiled as I watched two grown men actually begin hoisting themselves up over my fence, ignoring my warnings. But I didn't panic. Instead, I called out, "You're trespassing. The police have been notified." And as if on cue, a patrol car rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing, because the officers I'd called earlier had finally arrived. And the look on Karen's face when she saw them was priceless. Her triumphant grin collapsing into a twisted grimace, but she tried to recover, rushing up to the officers as if she was the victim, shrieking, "You need to arrest him. He's illegally keeping community property locked up." And I stood back, letting her dig her own hole, as the officers calmly asked for documentation, at which point I stepped forward, deed in hand, along with a folder full of HOA harassment letters and the police report I'd filed about the vandalism. And as they flipped through the papers, their expressions hardened, realizing what was really happening here. And one officer turned to Karen and said flatly, "Ma'am, this is clearly private property if you or anyone else attempt to enter without permission. You will be arrested for trespassing," and the gasp from the crowd was audible. Neighbors looking at Karen with wide eyes as the authority she had wielded for years crumbled in front of them. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Because instead of backing down, she began screaming at the officers, accusing them of being corrupt, accusing me of bribery, and even threatening lawsuits. But the more she ranted, the more unhinged she looked, until finally the officers had no choice but to warn her directly. "Calm down, or you'll be taken in for disorderly conduct," and that was the breaking point, because she froze, her mouth hanging open, the reality of the situation finally seeping in. And though she didn't apologize, she did retreat, storming back to her car and peeling away from the cul-de-sac in a cloud of dust, leaving behind her stunned supporters who quickly scattered, embarrassed to be associated with her meltdown. And as the street emptied out, I stood there with my lawyer, watching the last remnants of Karen's so-called grand reopening vanish, and I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Because while I had won this round, I knew she wasn't finished yet. And the real battle, the legal one, was still looming on the horizon. But at least now the entire neighborhood had seen her true colors. And the evidence against her was stronger than ever. And as I locked my gate again, listening to the fading sounds of distant laughter and muttering, I thought to myself, this isn't just about a pool anymore. It's about proving once and for all that Karen's reign of intimidation is over. And I promised myself I wouldn't rest until she was finally held accountable. No matter how long it took, or how dirty she played, because now she had shown her hand. And it was only a matter of time before the consequences crashed down on her like a wave she couldn't stop. After filing the police report, I thought Karen might finally back off, realizing that her antics had crossed a line into criminal territory. But if anything, it only seemed to fuel her rage and make her more determined to prove she was untouchable. Because within a week, I began noticing strange things happening around my property. Like garbage mysteriously dumped near my fence line, HOA violation letters, arriving almost daily for petty and laughable, accusations like grass, length exceeding acceptable standards, or mailbox paint knot, uniform, and even a formal notice claiming my outdoor lights were a hazard to community aesthetics, which was absurd since they were the exact same model half the neighborhood used. But it was clear Karen was orchestrating a campaign of harassment to bury me under constant pressure, hoping I'd cave and either leave or hand over control of the pool just to get her off my back. And though it was exhausting, I refused to give her the satisfaction. Meticulously documenting every letter, photographing every instance of trash dumping, and adding it all to the growing file of evidence I had started. Because at this point, I knew this wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about standing up to a bully who had spent years terrorizing the community unchecked. And while some neighbors still kept their heads down, afraid of getting on Karen's bad side, others began quietly expressing their support, leaving notes in my mailbox or whispering words of encouragement when we crossed paths. And one older resident even admitted that Karen had pulled similar stunts before, targeting anyone who dared challenge her authority. Though most people eventually gave up because they didn't want the stress, which only emboldened her, and that realization hardened my resolve. Because I wasn't going to roll over like everyone else. But then Karen made a move that crossed into dangerous territory. She organized a surprise HOA inspection of my property, showing up one Saturday morning with 3 of her board members and demanding entry to evaluate compliance, clipboard in hand and smug as ever. But I stood my ground at the gate, blocking their path and informing them in no uncertain terms that they had no right to enter without my consent or a court order. And when Karen tried to push past me, claiming that all common areas must be accessible for inspection, I laughed in her face and said, "This isn't a common area. It's my property. And if you step 1 foot inside, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." And though she tried to bluster, the presence of her board members, two of whom already looked deeply uncomfortable, forced her to back down. But not before she shouted loud enough for half the street to hear, "You're going to regret this, you selfish fraud," and stormed off, dragging the others with her. And I knew in that moment she was unraveling. Because instead of strategizing carefully, she was letting her anger dictate her actions. And that was going to be her downfall. But it also meant I had to stay sharp, because cornered people often lash out recklessly. And sure enough, the next escalation came just days later when I woke up to find a fresh coat of bright red. Paint splashed across my fence facing the street. The words "Community Pool Thief" scrawled in giant letters that dripped down the wood like blood. And my stomach dropped as I realized Karen had crossed into outright vandalism. Though of course she would deny it if confronted, but I wasted no time. Calling the police again and filing another report, this time with photos and a timeline of her harassment campaign. And though the officer couldn't arrest her without direct proof, he assured me that a pattern was emerging and advised me to consider installing cameras around the perimeter of my property, which I promptly did, setting up high-definition surveillance on every corner so that the next time she or her cronies tried something, I'd catch them red-handed. And in the meantime, I also contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, handing over my file and explaining everything that had happened from the bogus fines to the vandalism. And as the lawyer flipped through the evidence, his eyebrows shot up, and he said, "This is one of the most blatant abuses of HOA power I've ever seen. You have a very strong case here," which was music to my ears. But he also warned me that the process could take months, if not longer, because people like Karen didn't go down quietly, and I had to prepare myself for a drawn-out battle. And sure enough, Karen wasn't slowing down, in fact. She was ramping up, holding emergency HOA meetings where she spread more lies about me, claiming I was uncooperative, hostile, and even dangerous, painting a picture of me as a menace to the community. And though many residents didn't buy it anymore, a handful of her diehard supporters clung to her narrative, which only made neighborhood tensions worse, with whispers and gossip spreading like wildfire. And I could feel the division every time I walked down the street. Half the people offering sympathetic smiles, the other half glaring as if I had personally wronged them. But the breaking point came when Karen, in a last show of power, announced that the HOA would be reappropriating my pool for community use effective immediately, mailing out glossy flyers that invited residents to a grand reopening party, complete with food trucks and music. And when I pulled one of those flyers out of my mailbox, my jaw nearly hit the ground, because it was the boldest, most reckless move yet, openly declaring ownership of something she had no legal right to. And I knew instantly that this was going to blow up spectacularly, because not only had she set herself up for more humiliation, but she had also given me exactly the kind of public stunt that would expose her once and for all. And as I stood there staring at the flyer, I realized I had a decision. To make: either try to shut this down quietly before it happened, or let Karen dig her own grave by going through with it. And the more I thought about it, the more the second option appealed to me. Because sometimes the best way to win against someone like her is to let them self-destruct. And as I made that choice, a strange calm washed over me. Because I knew that whatever happened next, Karen had finally crossed the point of no return. And the trap she was setting for me was about to snap shut on her instead. The day of the final courtroom showdown arrived with the kind of tense hush you get before a storm. And for weeks beforehand, I had been living in a state of quiet preparation, meeting with my lawyer, organizing exhibits, lining up witness statements from neighbors who had finally found their courage, and double and triple checking every scrap of documentation that would prove the pool was mine and that Karen had orchestrated a campaign of harassment to seize it. The courthouse was crowded the morning the hearing began, not just with legal teams but with residents who wanted to see the spectacle unfold. And I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and resolve as I sat at the defense table with my lawyer, flipping through the thick binder that had become the map of this entire ordeal. While across the aisle, Karen sat with a face I barely recognized, the perpetual smirk replaced by a brittle, taut look, her hands clasped so tightly they were white at the knuckles, clutching at the last shreds of authority she had tried so desperately to hold on to. The judge called the courtroom to order, and proceedings began with a procedural rhythm that felt surreal compared to the chaos of the past months. The HOA's counsel opened with a theatrical recitation of bylaws and community welfare concerns, painting a picture half true, half fictional love, a man hoarding an amenity that should belong to the entire subdivision. But my lawyer, calm and methodical, asked for the floor to counter with hard facts: property surveys, construction permits, receipts for pool installation and maintenance paid from my account, video footage of Karen trespassing, sworn depositions from the pool company about who had authorized the draining, and a pile of HOA letters that, when stacked, looked less like governance and more like a paper trail of vendetta. One by one, we called witnesses who had been silenced for years, neighbors who remembered fines issued on a whim, parents who had been scolded for tucking in children too loudly, and even a former board member who admitted under oath that Karen had directed funds to her personal accounts and ordered events without proper votes. Their testimonies were precise and measured, and because they came from people the judge recognized as long-standing, respected residents, their words carried a weight that no printed flyer could match. The turning point in the courtroom, for me, was not a single dramatic reveal, but a steady accumulation of evidence. The arborist's report that had nothing to do with the pool, but showed a pattern of intimidation over property care. The timestamps on video showing Karen entering my property without permission. The receipts proving the HOA payments she claimed were community expenses were in fact routed to vendors she favored. And most damning of all, the recordings of her own voice at meetings, captured by an exasperated board member who had finally had the courage to record after being threatened. Those recordings played over the speakers like a slow unspooling of the truth, her words betraying not concern for the neighborhood, but a calculating intent to control and punish. As the hours passed, the judge's questions grew sharper, and even Karen's lawyer, who had begun with swagger, started to look defensive and thin at the edges. At one point, the judge interrupted to ask why such a personal campaign had been run through HOA channels instead of through any legitimate enforcement mechanism. And the empty silence from the defense table spoke volumes. When it came my turn to testify, I felt the courtroom shrink to the space between me and the judge. I spoke without theatrics, describing the nights I had sat on the porch listening for trespassers, the letters that made my mailbox a source of dread, the children who arrived at a party only to find a dry concrete bowl in place of the pool they'd been promised, and how the weight of constant harassment had affected not just me, but the community's sense of safety. My voice was steady because I had rehearsed the facts 1,000 times. But it carried an honest fatigue that I hoped the jurors understood. Karen's testimony, by contrast, unraveled in public. She tried to feign righteousness and concern for community access, only to be undone repeatedly by cross-examination that exposed contradictions in motivations. And when confronted with her own emails and the bank records showing suspicious transfers, her eyes darted, and eventually she read from a prepared statement that sounded rehearsed and hollow, as if someone reading a script written at the end of a failing performance. The HOA's counsel made a final attempt at salvage, arguing that community cohesion required compromise and that perhaps a solution could be mediated, but the judge, who had sat through the avalanche of evidence and watched the slow corrosion of an entire neighborhood under the weight of a single individual's abuse, leaned forward and said something that felt like a verdict long before the jury returned. Authority in a community must be exercised transparently, not weaponized. When the jury finally filed back into the room and the foreperson read the findings aloud, I felt an unbelievable lightness sweep through me, guilty on multiple counts where the evidence supported it. Harassment, misuse of HOA funds, trespassing, and an ordered restitution for the costs I had incurred defending my rights. The HOA as an entity was admonished and instructed to adopt strict oversight measures, and the judge issued an injunction that included a formal order barring Karen from contacting me or organizing events in the neighborhood without prior board approval and external oversight. And when the bailiff moved to escort her from the courtroom, she looked small and furious but powerless. The facade of invincibility fully shattered. The aftermath of the ruling was a curious mixture of relief and reckoning. Some neighbors came up to me with tears and apologies for not having spoken out sooner, while others, who'd been too scared to voice their dissent in the past, asked about how they could help rewrite bylaws and restore trust to the association. The board chastened and newly reconstituted, committed to transparency, open budgets, recorded votes, and an independent ombudsman to handle disputes, and there was a palpable shift from a culture of fear to one of empowerment. For my part, the financial and emotional toll of the fight lingered, but the victory felt like clearing a heavy fog. My pool returned to its role as a private, treasured space for my family, not a battleground for someone else's ego. And I spent the first weekend after the ruling sitting under the umbrella by the water with a book in my lap, simply letting sunlight and normalcy wash over the property that had been made precarious for so long. People planted flowers along the perimeter. Neighbors hosted barbecues unafraid of citations. And a committee formed to create a community charter that emphasized consent, clear processes, no more unilateral decisions, no more back-channel authority. Karen's legal penalties included fines and mandated restitution. And while some debated whether the punishment fit the crime, most of us recognized that the larger victory was cultural. An entire neighborhood had moved from silence to solidarity. In quiet moments, I reflected on what I had learned. Document everything. Build alliances. And most importantly, meet intimidation with calm persistence rather than impulsive retaliation. Because escalation tends to feed the fire, whereas steady legal and communal pressure can smother it. It was also a lesson in the necessity of systems that prevent power concentration in small boards without oversight. Because people with titles will sometimes forget that those titles are service roles, not crowns. Months later, as the wounds began to heal, I did something small but symbolic. I refilled the pool on a warm spring morning and invited the neighborhood to a casual, potluck-style gathering that was explicitly community-led and free of any official HOA trumpeting, no speeches. No sign-in sheets, just food, laughter, and splashing kids and watching neighbors greet each other without the old guarded expressions was the kind of healing that felt real. People shared stories of small kindnesses that had been overshadowed by fear, and some who had previously supported Karen came to me privately to say they had been swept up by her charisma, but now saw clearly how destructive unchecked control can be. As for Karen, she moved away a few months after the final rulings. A quiet departure that left only loose ends to be tied: restitution payments, final audits of HOA accounts, and ongoing community meetings to amend bylaws so this could never happen again. I didn't celebrate her leaving. There was no glee in watching someone's life unravel. But I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of closure, the sense that a long chapter had ended and a new one could begin. In the months and years that followed, the neighborhood evolved into a place where lines of communication were open, and where shared spaces were managed with clear consent. And every time I walked past the pool gate, now looking like a normal part of a homeowner's life rather than contested terrain, I felt a calm satisfaction that came from having defended what was mine without lowering myself to petty retribution. If there's one last thing I want anyone who has listened to this saga to take away, it's that bullies often rely on silence and confusion if you document. Stand together and use the proper channels. You can reclaim your boundaries and rebuild your peace. And if you liked hearing this story and want to follow more real-life HOA battles and tales of standing up to entitled neighbors, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories so you don't miss the next unbelievable chapter of justice served where it matters most.